Welcome to Out with Dan, the podcast that spotlights and examines the voices of LGBTQ+ authors, characters, and our allies. Together, we lift our voices and we tell our stories. I'm Dan White. Join me as I chat with this week's author. Hello, and welcome back to Out with Dan. Today, I'm excited to chat with Tyler Gillespie about his book, The Thing About Florida, and its subtitle is Exploring the Misunderstood State. Welcome, Tyler.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Oh, I'm so excited. I lived in Florida for about 12 years in the 80s and 90s, and Florida is definitely the misunderstood state. Now, there's some people that act out and they get in the news. They know they're going to get in the news. They're looking for their 15 minutes of fame. I've seen it, done it. I probably, if the circus of media was a little more, maybe I would have been one of those. Fortunately not. So anyway, but I love the fact that this book doesn't only talk about the Florida man, but it also talks about the myth of the Florida man. So want to give us an idea of what the book is about?
Yeah, so I started seeing the meme, a few years ago, kind of circulated on the internet, and I wasn't living in Florida at the time. I had, moved out of the state, and so people would ask me about it frequently, So I kind of decided to figure out, well, what is going on down here in Florida, So that kind of started me to look into the history of how Florida's been portrayed in the news and why some of the headlines have been viral and, the kind of phenomenon of virality. And I'm really interested in what happens after the stories, So I kind of started to dig into that, like our public records laws and, all of that kind of thing. And yeah, and then I was able to interview somebody who had been a Florida woman headline, actually, and then kind of found out what happened to her life after that. Because like you were saying, I too could potentially have been a Florida man at one point, before the kind of the internet is what it was. So I wanted to see what it was like for somebody.
I think it's important that I lived there before internet famous because so I will share that when I lived in Miami, up in Fort Lauderdale, there was a gay bar called the Everglades Bar. Oh. And during spring break, it was a everybody for themselves bar, but their big claim to fame was people came there on spring break and there was a contest to see how many live goldfish you could swallow. Mm-hmm. And it has now since, they don't do that anymore, but this is something that, pre-internet and social media, I mean, it was a big phenomenon. People knew about it. All these college kids coming down and high school kids coming down, they knew about this place. Mm-hmm. And you get these reputations. But one of the things that I so loved about your book is not only do you talk about the Florida man, but you really talk about the real Florida that a lot of people don't see.
Yeah. But you didn't tell us how many goldfish did you? So.
I don't eat sushi, so that's it. Yeah, I did. I certainly drank enough to be able to have swallowed goldfish. That's for sure. The Everglades was a fun place, but I never went during spring break. I knew better.
So yeah, I'm a fifth generation Floridian. So my family, as long as have traced our family has been connected to the state, So I grew up here kind of around a lot of folks seeing their everyday lives, and that really has shaped me. And so also thinking about how your state's own reputation of, in my case, like Florida man, how did that affect how people saw me and how I saw myself? So common journey for people, because, no matter where you're from, a lot of the times people hate it. Someone was telling me their daughters are living in New York City and they hate being from New York City, and that's like my dream when I was a kid, to be from New York City and not from Florida, So it's kind of that kind of journey, that kind of narrative. But I wanted to look at some of the other myths about Florida, like you were saying, like about our environmental situation and how a fantasy course and the environment, looking at sort of kind of those topics that were interesting to me.
I found that one of the things that I was so drawn to was the cattle farmers. I did not realize, having been up and down both the west and the east coast of Florida, I hadn't really been through the middle of it. And I didn't realize how many cowboys there were and how much cattle was raised in Florida.
That's one of my favorite chapters, and because I wasn't really expecting to, be that interested in cattle or cows. I mean, yes, cowboys, but but so I was writing about the states, about Florida's role in the Civil War, and how their one of their main contributions was producing cattle, and and I didn't know that, and so there are all these excuse me, cattle ranchers all over the state. And these folks often, and like the people that I talk to, are eighth or nine generations of Floridians, including their grandchildren. And so I was able to hang out with some of them and a day in the life kind of thing. And, they care a lot about the land too. And because these aren't mass produced agriculture or cattle farming, they're homegrown, family owned kind of situations. So that's what I was focusing on, not these huge, like, dairy farms. Excuse me. So yeah, I was able to chat with them and talk about the environment and talk about how people's eating habits have changed. Because one of the cowboys told me the story about these folks who saw some cows, saw him and drove up on his land and was like, I want to eat this cow. Because people now want to know where their meat's coming from, and but he was like, that's not the way we do things, like around here. But,
I'll tag this one belongs to me. Yeah. Right. But one of the things that I noticed in that was their deep love for the land and the environment and clean eating and doing things that preserved the land and honored the land, which is something that I don't think most of us, when I get a steak at a restaurant or at the grocery store, I don't necessarily think of that. I mean, I would like a good one, but you don't always think what goes on behind not just the beef, but behind the farm and the farmer and all of that. And that's one of the things that was so interesting to me.
And I think too, I mean, as they were telling me, like, their reputation has changed, because some of them are, conservationists. They put a lot of their land into these easements and things, because it was also connected to Florida was having, and is still having, a lot of water quality issues with like the algal blooms and stuff. And people were blaming partially their ranching practices in terms of like the fertilizer runoff into the water and all of that kind of stuff. But they were talking about, at least the people I talked to were talking about how seriously they take it and they test their water and all of that kind of thing. But I love that, because there's I interviewed one of the ranchers' wives, and she was talking about how much time they have to spend with the cows. It takes them about 2 years to get from a calf to, a size where someone would want to purchase it to eat it or whatever. And sometimes, they get to know the cows. They have personalities. And yes. She was talking about how much, like, she was, how much when she was new to the ranch, loved the cows. And she would say she'd get special with them because she would name them and all of that. And, and then things would happen, like they'd have to sell them, or, they would get like hit by lightning or, die. And it was really sad for her. And that really touched me, I think, because, I never thought about that perspective, so.
I'm the same way, as long as, so I have a separation. It's either in the grocery store or on a farm, but I don't want to see the process from one place to the other. I'm a little more sensitive than that. Which sort of brings me up to something else from my childhood, because I did go to several hog killings for lack of a better term for it. I would go afterwards. I'd go a little later in the practice. But one thing and I grew up in North Carolina, one thing I saw quite a bit there is the passion of Confederate reenactments, or the Civil War reenactments, I think is probably a better way to put it. And I was oblivious to that living in Florida as well. I did not know that was something that was as big as it is. I did in the South, but even though Florida is definitely the South, it doesn't always represent that way. So, how did you like that part of the people you interviewed?
I really enjoyed. So basically, I didn't really know about Florida's role in the Civil War. Excuse me. Even, as a Floridian, I didn't learn much about my history or the state's history in school. We learned about the Fountain of Youth and visit the Fountain of Youth, whatever.
Right.
So it's like this mythology of the state without actually, a lot of the lived experiences. And I found that to be true for a lot of Floridians who grew up in the state. I mean, I think I vaguely knew that Florida was in the Civil War, but I didn't realize, its role, and that they weren't really fighting too much here because Florida was super undeveloped, swampland and things at the time. But there was the battle that I went to happened in the state. And so I was really interested in this idea that if I had been a Floridian at the time, that I could have potentially fought in the Confederacy or been somehow, connected to it. And thinking about that, and what kind of implications does that have in today's moment for me? Like, what responsibility do I have in terms of, race and other aspects connected to that? So I really wanted to understand why people do this, and I think I'm curious in why people want to do any of these things that I write about, but specifically this, because it is so controversial right now, and so especially reenacting as a person in the Confederacy. So someone in the Union was telling me, like, if you reenact as a Union member, it's all nobody's really batting an eye. But then if you reenact as a Confederate, you could lose your job, because we're associating that with racism and sometimes neo-Nazism and like a lot of different things, So I wanted to know, why are people doing that, Yeah.
When I was in Boston a couple of years ago, I went north and I drove up to Maine, drove along the coast. And there I came upon a Union reenactment. And it was sort of two camps. So one was a Union reenactment and one was sort of like the Pilgrims and stuff. And as you say, history, I don't like history whitewashed. I like to know exactly what history is. There was extreme racism and a lot of hatred during the Civil War. Yet it was some people's family, good, bad, or indifferent. And a few people, or some people, are highlighting their family. And then, of course, we also know in this world, their bigots will get a toehold in anywhere they can. So there is a responsibility of both. And I thought that in that section of your book, I thought you handled it with a lot of delicacy, but directness. And it was very, very interesting.
Thank you. Yes, I appreciate that, because that was probably the hardest chapter because for me to write. I mean, like you were saying, a lot of people are doing it because of their family history. So I'm writing about my family history in a different kind of way. We're kind of doing, as a lot of people are, and I think now grappling with the fact that, I mean, as white people, like, our histories are connected to these things, and so how do we handle that in this moment, and what do we do about that, or what can we do about that? So it was complicated, and also I don't think there are some people that didn't want to talk to me. So I didn't really know what was going to happen, but then I found that when I did talk to people, and the people that I talked to, and that's the thing that I say in the chapter too, like, these are only the people that I talk to. I don't, and only what they said to me. I can't know what would have happened if I was, in a different moment, or talking to what happened at camp at night when I wasn't there,
And I think, we, as human beings, we have the ability to share our own narrative, but as human beings, we also have the ability to change the narrative and not tell the truth. So I do agree with you. You have to sort of step gingerly and hope people are being honest with you. But as long as you're sharing what you experienced, you know, it is who I am, you are who you are, and we're simply sharing our experience.
Exactly. And I think, I think it was like, but this has happened before COVID, right? And so interest in the reenactors was also waning. And now I don't even know if they're reenacting it. I think I may have gone to one of the last ones, honestly, for at least that particular
Right.
one, right? So I don't really know what it will look like moving forward, but
So you grew up in Clearwater or close to Clearwater, is that correct?
In Largo, which is
In
near
Largo.
Clearwater.
All right. So I know one of the things that when I lived in Florida and I would trip over to the West Coast, it was much quieter, obviously, than the East Coast. And when I say obviously, because the East Coast, Florida is like California, it's promoted a lot because of tourism. So Florida gets its narrative out, whether it's true or not. But sort of back in the day, say in the 80s and 90s, the West Coast of Florida was a lot less populated than the East Coast. But now I've been back to St. Pete several times in Sarasota and Fort Myers, and it's an entirely different world today than say when you were growing up. And as life changes, so does Western Florida as well. I loved Randy and his parents, and back in the day, you could get in a gay bar at a fairly early age, if you smiled and winked the right way. Most of the time, Florida, like Louisiana, had a very liberal agenda to selling alcohol. So it was usually quite easy. So give us a little idea about Randy and what you discovered in gay bars and going to drag shows at an earlier age.
So I grew up a Southern Baptist. I went to a Southern Baptist elementary, middle, and high school. And, I'd be expelled for coming out at the time. And I couldn't, and it's weird how the schools are because it was really hard for me to transfer schools. I looked into it, in 10th grade, 11th grade, figuring out, oh, okay, what's up? I like guys, what do I do about this? And they made it hard for the credits to transfer. So, because of we had Bible class, that was one of the classes, and we went to chapel and stuff like that. So I had found a fake ID and on a college trip, and I had really short hair at the time, and this guy had buzzed hair, whatever, So I was able to get into the bars. And when I was 17, we were crossing the bridge to go to Tampa, which was always, I kind of joke about it being away from God's eyes in Tampa. I could do
and going to Oz. Woo, we're going to Oz.
That bridge just really separated it. Because you're right. I mean, where I live in Largo, or where I grew up, I live in St. Pete now, which has, like you were saying, completely changed in the past 10 years. It's fascinating. But in Largo, it is more retirement. It's a quieter spot, And so I'd hit it to Tampa, and there I would get in, go early to get in for free. I was broke and all of that. And so I would, talk to some of the people who were there as well, some of the people, and just hear their stories. And so that was a whole new world to me. And it's definitely, I think of it as a different kind of education at the time. I was learning so much about, the community's history, culture, media, all of that kind of stuff. It's also, it's interesting to talk about because now I'm sober. I've been in recovery for over a decade, but I really like going to the gay bars because, those conversations were happening, and I don't know where else I would have been able to have them at that time. Because, I didn't know about community centers and youth programs that didn't know about.
And I'm older than you, but I can tell you that when I lived in Florida, there were none of those. There were no youth centers. There were no centers at all. I remember there was a place called Lambda Passages, which was a bookstore in Miami that mostly carried gay and lesbian, LGBTQ plus books. magazines and stuff. But really, unless you went to a bar, you really couldn't get an immersion into gay life. And it's not like we get a toaster or anything, but you know, if you're going to find out about
Oh,
your
really?
history, if you're going to find out about your history, you have to find your tribe. And that was one of the things, that was always one of the things about Florida. It was a really welcoming place when you went out and you had a good time. But that's where we found our history.
And
And we made history.
exactly, and especially in the 80s and 90s. I mean, I write about that in the book too, but that's something that I'm really interested in right now. But I was thinking about the youth center because I was literally out yesterday in downtown St. Pete, and there's a Metro Center there that has like creative writing class and board games for youth and all of these programs and everything like that. So it's really cool and exciting for those folks, but didn't have that back then.
No, I didn't either, but I do think it's so wonderful, and that is something that is some other chapters in your book. You talk about people who, like Nadine Smith, who make such a difference. There are these people who make life in Florida much better, and in this, you know, in this instance, Equity Florida. I mean, it's something that hopefully as we go along increases and we have more and more inclusion, which is so very important in today's world.
And I think too, so like kind of connecting back to Randy, who is a drag queen who cut my hair. I need to go back to him because his hair is not where it needs to be. But anyway, you know, trying something new. But anyway, you know, he was talking about how things, because he's and he's from Pinellas Park, which is near St. Pete, and he used to get bullied super, super bad, so badly that he had to drop out of high school and went to beauty school, and his mom put him in beauty school, and he was performing in drag in the 80s and 90s during the, you know, at the height of AIDS, and talking about how that transformed nightlife and friendships and family and the whole community. And that's when you were talking about the 80s and 90s and South Florida and the Keys and stuff like that has such a rich history because so many people were moving there at that time, you know, and I think that's something that people don't often realize, like, and talking about Nadine Smith, who's a trailblazer in Florida and Equality Florida and has done so much work. And I think that's the thing too, like, especially in this moment, people are looking at Florida right now after, you know, with what the current legislator and government is doing. And it's like, oh, Florida, you know, all this stuff is not a great place. But it's like our history in terms of the LGBT community is actually really important and has affected the whole country in some kinds of ways, which is also kind of what's, I think, making people scared about, you know, him, like the passage of the Don't Say Gay bill and things like that, is because Florida, as much as people, and this is what I write about in the book, as much as people want to joke about Florida, you know, the Florida man, the pythons eating the Everglades, you know, all of these kind of things, like, it really is sometimes a barometer of what happens next. I mean, especially in terms of the environment, like thinking about Python and stuff like that. But politics, it's in a unique space, right? So I think that's something that I really want and hope people will realize and understand, is that there are people like Nadine Smith, you know, other people who have been fighting for Floridians in the country, and they're continuing to do that. And you know,
I think that is one of the greatest things about your book. The thing about Florida is the fact that we do see all different kinds of sides of Florida. We've only talked about, sort of hit the surface on 3 things. There's a lot more in this book, and it's a wonderful book. So I was in St. Pete having lunch with some friends of mine, and I asked them if they knew a local writer or had a suggestion, and your book was their suggestion. So it's a wonderful, wonderful read. It's completely nonfiction. It's your exploring your roots and where you came from in your home state. And I'm glad you wrote it. It's important. And as the optimistic person that I try to be, Florida has a lot of issues right now, but Florida's had issues for years, and it has managed to crawl out of the issues time and time again. So I am optimistic that just like the rest of the nation, hopefully will go in a lot more progressive way in the future.
I'm on that page too. Honestly, I know that's like, I don't know, just hope is really important right now. And I appreciate you mentioning that and everything, and that your friends mentioned it too. And, just for folks, I kind of mix memoir, my personal writing, with archival research, looking at these old newspapers and documents with interviews with Floridians across the state.
Are you working on something now?
I am. I'm working. Well, okay. Two things. I have a poetry collection coming out in 2023 in April, Poetry Month, which is completely about machines and robots and love. Like,
all right, I'm digging it.
But the book that I'm working on right now is about LGBTQ communities, specifically in Florida, and how they've resisted in times of danger and peril. Like, so starting with the Johns Committee in like the 60s and looking at different, time periods and how Floridians have resisted and what that can teach us, even from folks who aren't from Florida, like what that can teach us about our history and also how to combat a lot of the negativity that's happening right now.
Wonderful. Well, I hope you'll come back and join me again, because I want to talk about that, because I lived that. So
yes, because you were talking about that bookstore too. I'm going to have a chapter in the book about what books, the role of bookstores, because specifically gay bookstores. I mean, we don't really have that many anymore, and
nope.
But they at one point were super, super vital.
Yes, I will say that honestly, from Lambda Passages, I discovered authors and books that I never would have discovered without them. So I applaud them, and it was a part of my life, and it's a wonderful fabric to be woven in, and I like it a lot. Thank you so much, Tyler, for coming on Out with Dan and chatting with me.
Thank you for having me. This was so fun. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And do you want to share any kind of social media or website you have?
So I'm on Twitter at Tyler MTG. My name is Tyler Michael Thomas Gillespie, so that's where that comes from. I'm on Instagram as that as well. I'm on Venmo as that as well. Whatever. And my website is just tylermtg.com.
Perfect. Thank you once again, and hang on for me, and I'll be right back.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Out with Dan. You can find more information about this podcast and its host at outwithdan.com, on Twitter at OutWithDan, and on Instagram and Facebook at GoOutWithDan. This podcast is hosted by Authors on the Air Global Radio Network, and the theme music is provided by bensound.com. Join us again soon for the next episode of Out with Dan.